Paul, and if you've been to my channel before, perhaps you know I've talked a lot about the world transition that we've been in for quite a number of years now. I have an interesting life, and I was born in India, and during the early part of my life I learned how to meditate, and I became curious about a lot of the various prophecies and teachings that we've inherited from around the world about basically New Age stuff, in a way, not in a really a jargon kind of way, but in a New Age means that evolution, you might say, or the transformation of human society. And if you study history at all, you'll realize that there's all kinds of different major transformations that have happened in the society as we go back even a few thousand years. And without getting into all that in detail, but most empires that have been here, we kind of like look around in their ruins and pick up the big blocks and try to put the statues back up there and figure out what happened. So I talk a lot about preparation because for me, especially as someone who's traveled, I was born in India and I've seen a little bit of the world. I've been to Thailand and things, and you see a lot of different kinds of terrain, and you talk to people and you read a little bit about their history. And for example, I've never been to Haiti, but you see on the news that just in my lifetime, a number of times there have been some really serious problems in Haiti. So what I think about is statistics to a certain extent of, let's say you have a whole bunch of major possible problems, natural disasters, and if you have a whole lot of different possibilities, and then you give it a lot of time, maybe 100 years, and you have a huge planet, there literally, in my lifetime, there have been so many areas in the world where literally the world ended for these people. They had no way to travel. I mean, you can name it: Turkey, Nepal, all around the world, tsunamis, and Thailand, and Afghanistan, and every other place you can imagine. There's like incredible catastrophes. Chile and volcanoes, and it's not really a theoretical thing. So I get a little bit, I annoy a few people sometimes, and family members or even friends, that they go, why does Paul always talk about these things? And one of the reasons that I talk about is the things that you can become conscious of in advance are the things that you can prevent, you see. So I have a private pilot license, and I have a few hundred hours now, and you have to, no matter, even if it's a small plane, you have to learn emergency landings. It may never happen in all your flying life. I knew a guy who flew 10,000 hours, and he said 3 times he had an engine failure. He survived all 3. He had certain problems with fuel or whatever, and he survived, went down to an airport, glided down or whatever, and 10,000 hours. So one time every 3,000 or so hours, and if you're well prepared, even then, if it does happen, it doesn't mean that it's the end of the end, So it might be the end for the airplane, but not for the person. Now, you apply that to life, and you think about, where do I want to live in the world? Think about that. If you think I'm going to live, there are people who buy homes. I'm a realtor, and they basically make a plan. I'm going to pay for this home for 30 years. They may not live there 30 years, but out in the rural areas, there's a lot of people who've had a family home for 100 or 200 years. I sold one last year that had been in one family for well over 200 years. And that's a long time in this country. So what we have to be aware of in piloting, for example, in life, is that what is outside our perimeter of possibilities? What could happen? It may not happen, but if you think, well, let's say there's 10 or 20 different kinds of really possible disasters that could happen, natural or otherwise, and you figure, well, over a period of 20 years, if you live in one area for 20 years, and there's 20 different possible things, there's a very good likelihood that you're going to experience something depending on your choices of where to live. And again, I'm a realtor, and I specialize in real property, and I don't try to tell anybody where they should live or what they should do in their life. I can only tell you what I do, and frankly, over the last 30, 40 years of my life, I've avoided a whole lot of problems by choosing where I lived. I've also avoided a whole lot of costs. So I'm going to go through a few basic things here today, and there's a lot of political stuff that goes on, and survival and getting away from and mitigating disasters of all different kinds is not a political thing. You see, I mean, there are disasters that are certainly caused by, incompetent politicians, of which there are many, but those problems we're not going to talk about first. I'm going to talk about some real basic problems that can happen realistically, and a number of things that are outside the normal perimeter of many people's view in their day-to-day life, that just to bring your awareness to them of things that could happen. And just like in aviation, if you have a small problem, let's say you can't find your direction for a little while and you just get a little bit confused. Maybe there's some clouds or something. And then if you don't think carefully, if you panic and you go off in the wrong direction, make a wrong decision, then it's a compounded error, and one error leads to another error, and another, and then it gets worse. So the whole idea in aviation and life is to mitigate, avoid, compensate for, train for, rehearse, be conscious of the various possibilities. Now, one of the things that I talk about a lot is electrical power outages. Now, a lot of people don't really know a little bit of electronics and electricity. I do. I had some actual training in electronics and electricity and so on. And when electrical devices fail, it's very, very sudden, and you many times don't even have a warning. For example, the transformers that you see on these poles around the neighborhood, you see these big old transformers. They're usually a big cylinder, and every so often they put one there. And basically that device has a coil in it, and it helps direct and maintain the electrical flow. Now, those coils are very, very expensive, and they don't just keep a whole bunch of them laying around for free. Okay, they always have a few spares, but a lot of them now are protected by circuit breakers to some extent. But a power outage can happen for many, many different reasons, anywhere in the country, anytime, any season, and there's a long history, even in my lifetime, of various power outages. In New York City, had a power outage for 4 days, and complicated problems. If a power outage happens for a few hours, it's okay. Okay, hey, the lights came back on, whoopee-doo. Okay, now, if it goes on for a day, or 2 days, or 3 days, or 4 days, or 2 weeks, now you got some serious, serious problems. Garbage doesn't get picked up, and if it's accompanied by a storm or ice storm or something, now you got more problems, and if it's a hurricane, then you got even more problems. So a power outage is one thing that to be aware of that is very, very possible. In those kind of situations now, we depend on electricity so much. But as someone who's traveled a little bit in the world and born in India, I know that people have lived way up in the mountains of all parts of the world for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're still there. And if New York City disappeared off the earth, they probably wouldn't even know. And even if they did know, they probably wouldn't care. They would just go on with their life. So how you live, where you live, and the choice we make, especially with the technology now, we have ways to communicate and be out in our country regions and still be in touch and still be able to get to a highway or a train or an airplane or something. So, power outage, that's one really biggie. Now, there's a few natural disaster types of things that I'd like to bring people's attention to. As we know, even in my lifetime, I think it was only, I can't remember the year, it wasn't too long ago, 2006 or something like that. Anyway, there was a huge tsunami that happened. Of course, we know the one in Japan, that happened in 2011, I think it was. And there's a whole lot of other things that have happened regarding tsunamis, Haiti, and many places. So earthquakes and tsunamis, there's areas in the country that, for example, in the northwest of the United States, they have done some studies, and they know that there's been periodic tsunamis that went way inland and destroyed miles inland every few hundred years, and it's overdue, you see. So there's one, okay? It's outside of perimeter. We don't know if it's going to happen. Might happen, could happen. La Palma volcano off the northwest part of Africa. If that goes off, there's a lot of activity lately. If that goes off, it could make a tsunami across the entire eastern seaboard. And you'd have about 8 hours notice. And look what would happen with the traffic situation. See, again, compounded problems. You have one problem, which is a storm coming inland, or a tsunami. And maybe it isn't that terrible, but then if it knocks out the power, then you got another problem. If it blocks all the traffic and knocks some bridges down, then you got another problem. And now you have a serious disaster on your hands. And all the people who live along the coast, I would regard, please think about it a little bit, because some of the places along the coast of the United States are also vulnerable to earthquakes, not just storms and hurricanes, like, for example, San Francisco or Los Angeles or Florida. Florida is very vulnerable, very lot of low-lying land. Florida used to be underwater, actually. A lot of people don't know that, millions of years ago. But the thing is that natural disasters can happen, and the problem can be augmented by, for example, our dependence on traffic flow or trains or bridges and electricity. So therefore, the way we live, there's a saying in being a pilot, like, if it's important, have a spare. So look around in your life and see what's important and say, well, I better get a spare, whatever that is. Medicines, food, clothing, whatever you need, tools. Even places where, you could have a country home. If you have like a nice place on the beach, maybe you don't want to live at the beach all year long because of certain seasons, but you can have it there, but you have a little refuge place to get away from it. And when you see the weather coming in, you just go there. Now, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and that kind of thing are also another very big natural catastrophe. So that's another thing to be aware of. And that choices of where to live. You can see now there's all kinds of data online where the biggest storms are, where the earthquake zones are, and so on. Now, storms, snowstorms. If you've ever been in a blizzard, a lot of people have never been in a blizzard, but when we're talking about when it snows for 24 hours or 36 hours, and then you keep looking out your window and you wonder when it's going to stop, and it just doesn't stop, and then serious problems can be caused by a blizzard and mounting snowfall. Now, if you live north of the 40-degree line in this country or anywhere in the world, basically, there's a long history. That's where the glaciers used to be. New York City and all that area used to be under a whole lot of ice. And not to say that's going to come back anytime soon, but in my lifetime, we've been warned about the ice age, and, climate has cycles. I mean, it goes up and it goes down, and that's a very well known. And if you keep track of it for a long time, like they do, they'll know that the line of climate, it never just goes straight one way. It never does. Yeah, it might have a trend, but it goes up and down, and then it goes down, and then up and down, and various things. And people don't know that most of the history of this planet, let's say for the last 200,000 or 300,000 years, if you look at a geology source online or something, you'll find out that where were the glaciers? Most of the time on Earth, the last 200,000 or 300,000 years were glacial. Thousands and thousands of years with huge ice packs and people chopping flint and hunting deer and killing mammoths. And then when it finally warmed up and everything, something happened and all that ice melted. We don't even know how the hell it melted, really. And then for thousands of years, the sea kept rising. We had all these myths that people say, well, the sea keeps rising, and we had this flood and everything because the glaciers were melting at an astronomical pace for some reason. Now, let's talk a little bit about climate here for a few minutes here. Climate is cyclical, and there's a lot of resources that you can go online and you can listen to experts, and I've listened to a lot of people. If you listen to just TV, that's one side. But you go listen to hundreds of scientists, and there are experts in statistics and numbers and climate and geology, and you listen to the consensus of these people who really do the research is that, well, climate is cyclical. And there's absolutely no doubt about it. And if you our lifetime is maybe 100 years. Maybe we have our little recent history going back to Columbus, or maybe going back to the Renaissance, a few hundred years. What's that in climate? It's nothing. And even in the last few hundred years, like, they've had all kinds of freezing problems and droughts and blights and things like that around the world, in different parts of the world. Hurricanes and floods and tsunamis are nothing new. It's been just the way the planet is. And that's why prudence, just being aware of what could happen, and by making choices, we can decide and maximize our odds of survival and actually pleasantly surviving. That's why a lot of the oldest cultures are in the hills. Tibet, or the mountains of Himalaya, or Peru, and these people are going on with their lives, and whatever happened down there a few hundred feet above sea level, I don't know what happened down there, but they have their own little history. And that's why they survive, because they're up in the mountains. And built amazing structures up there as well, people who know this. So, again, the prudence. Now, what could happen? Tsunamis, floods, electricity outages, power outages, blizzards, storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, if you know. Now, mitigation. We can have mitigation. We can have avoidance. That's our aspect. If we have, like in aviation, you have a certain wind frequency or speed that you have to deal with, and direction, and you have to figure out your navigation and cloud cover and what the speed of wind is at different altitudes, and you have all those things that you can't control. But you have things in your own control, and you have tools like this this old 1940s navigation tool for aviation. And it looks a little funny, but when you learn how to use this thing, it's just a tool. And we have our tools of our brain, and now we have the GPS, we have the weather forecast, we can find out all kinds of stuff about all the terrain and where we live and the predictions and everything, and use our own judgment, which is the final resource, our own brain and intelligence, to figure out what we personally should do and how we should approach this. But my role here in communicating what I know is just, look, I connect a lot of dots and I listen to experts. I'm not a personal expert in geology or everything. I don't have to be. I just listen to these experts of a very, very large spectrum of people, and I assimilate and use my own intelligence to figure out, okay, what is the synopsis of what these people are saying? Okay, climate is vulnerable. It always is. Now, the way our modern life is constructed, a natural disaster like a hurricane and those kinds of things, earthquakes, can be tremendously worsened by, for example, a cul-de-sac. I'm a realtor, and you probably have seen these types of designs where you have like all these houses, and I know people who live in them. Like, you go down this little street, and then there's like 5 or 6 houses. They might be really nice houses. Now, what would happen in a disaster when all these people need to leave because, okay, there's a snowstorm or blizzard, a power outage, they all want to get out? How are they going to get out? When everybody, and most of the time in these developments, you'll see there's many of these cul-de-sacs, and they all lead to, there's like 20 different cul-de-sacs, and they all lead to this one exit. So use some intelligence and thoughtfulness about how you have your life. You duplicates of things. Let's run through a bit here again. Intelligence about choices. The observational resources of information that we can get online. In aviation, they call it all available information. You make a flight plan. You say, okay, where am I going? What are my options? What could happen? What can I do about it? What's my vehicle like? What kind of condition am I in? Do I have the right tools, equipment for emergency? And so on. Have some reflection on your life and have some options in mind, because in aviation it's like you have at least 2 options. You're required to have an optional landing place, and if you're smart you'll have more than one. So thanks again for listening. I appreciate feedback and comment. I don't want to be alarmist, but I just want to be prudent, and just in my personal life, and I've lived in a rural area for a long time in my life. I grew up in India in the mountains, and I've been into rural areas in other parts of the world. And the way people live, they're very ingenious, they're very simple. They have their food access close, they have their water access close. If they need to store water, they do. If they need to store food, they do. All of that is just common sense and has part of a tradition of human life for forever, basically. And in our modern life, we might have a garage full of tools, but can you find them when you need them? Do you know how they work? Have you ever used them? Will they work when you want them to? You see, so our modern life, we have to keep that in mind, because we clutter up our life in some way that makes our escape or our survival more challenging and more difficult. Then we're only hurting ourselves and our family if we don't have some awareness of the situation. So again, thanks again for listening.